Every memory you hold is a story that never stopped being written. You think remembering is returning, but it sits really rewriting. Each time you look back, your mind opens the file again, edits a line, changes the lighting, adds a feeling that wasn't there before. And when it closes the file, the original version is gone, replaced by something that only feels like truth. Science calls it reconsolidation, the quiet rewriting that happens every time a memory wakes up. Emotion acts as the editor, nostalgia as the color grade, and your brain, desperate for coherence, trades accuracy for meaning. So the past you recall isn't the one you lived. It steps the one your present self needed to survive. And the more you remember, the further it drifts from what really happened. Tonight at Neuro Nap Academy, we will unravel the reverse memory paradox, why every recollection is both an act of remembering and creation, and how the mind keeps sculpting its own history to stay whole. So take a slow breath, and let SIPs step into level 1, the shifting mirror. You remember something simple, a walk home after rain, the pavement slick, the streetlights stretching thin reflections across the asphalt. You can almost hear the sound your shoes made, that soft, adhesive peel as they lifted from the ground. But if you pause and listen closely, you might notice the sound you hear isn't really from that night. It's from the way you imagine it now. Your brain has pulled fragments from different places, the humidity from another evening, the sound of rain from another year, even the emotion of a different version of you, and stitched them together into what feels like one seamless event. You don't replay the past, you reassemble it. That's the quiet truth behind every memory. What you recall is not a recording, but a reconstruction. Each time you summon a moment from your past, billions of neurons coordinate in a complex dance, reactivating patterns that once fired together. But like dancers who improvise slightly each time, they never reproduce the choreography perfectly. Connections strengthen or weaken, new associations sneak in. The brain is alive, and so is its past. Imagine it like a mirror made not of glass, but of liquid mercury. Each time you look, the reflection quivers and reforms, familiar yet slightly altered. You may think you're gazing at the same image, but your mind has already changed it. The mirror's fluidity is what allows you to keep recognizing yourself, even as you age. In neuroscience, this shifting process is essential. The regions involved, mainly the hippocampus and the neocortex, operate not as a museum, but as a living workshop. When a memory is reactivated, it becomes malleable, like clay warmed by touch. The hippocampus reopens the neural pathways that encoded the experience, allowing the brain to update the information before storing it again. It's called reconsolidation, and it's one of the most remarkable forms of neural plasticity. But the mind doesn't announce this edit. It lets you believe the past is stable because that illusion keeps you grounded. If you are fully aware of how much your memories morph, reality itself might feel less trustworthy. So the brain wraps each new version in the same emotional packaging, the same colors, sounds, and sensations, giving you the impression of continuity. Think of your memories as letters written in invisible ink. Each time you reread one, the warmth of your attention rewrites a few lines before fading again. You never see the corrections, only the story as you need it to be right now. Philosophically, that's both liberating and unsettling. If your past changes each time you recall it, then who are you? Are you the person who lived those moments, or the one remembering them? Perhaps you're both, an evolving author revising a manuscript that never ends. It also means that memory is not about the past at all. It's about coherence. Your brain constantly negotiates between accuracy and meaning, choosing whichever best serves the story of you. When recalling a joyful childhood, it may enhance the light, mute the arguments, and soften the fear. When recalling failure, it might exaggerate the pain to remind you not to repeat it. Memory is not passive storage, it's emotional strategy. And yet, amid these constant rewrites, there is a strange constancy, the feeling of familiarity. Even as details blur, the emotional core remains. You may forget what someone said, but not how they made you feel. That's because emotional memory, governed largely by the amygdala, operates through a different network, more primal, less flexible. It's why nostalgia can outlast the facts that gave rise to it. You might notice this when you visit your childhood home. The rooms look smaller, the colors feel faded, but something in you hums with recognition, a kind of invisible frequency. That hum isn't in the walls, it's in your neural patterns, traces of how your body once felt there. You are responding not to the place as it is, but to the echo of how it once felt to be you in that place. The mirror shifts again. You look at the past, and the past looks back, adjusted to fit your present gaze. So when you catch yourself wondering whether a memory is real, remember that it always is, just not in the way you think. It's real because it reflects who you are now, what you believe, what you need to feel whole. The mind's mirror doesn't aim for fidelity, it aims for survival. In that way, every recollection is a quiet act of rebirth, the past re-emerging through the architecture of the present. And this is only the surface. Beneath it lies the intricate machinery that makes this fluidity possible, the brain's way of reactivating old neural patterns while weaving in new ones, like editing a film whose negatives are never truly fixed. The next time you close your eyes and recall a moment, pay attention not just to what you remember, but to what your memory chooses to emphasize and what it lets dissolve. The gaps, the blurs, the brightened edges, they're not flaws, they're fingerprints of a living system in motion. The shifting mirror is not deceit, it's the brain's art form. And to understand how it performs this subtle trick, how it rebuilds the world each time you remember, we have to look closer at the machinery itself. Because remembering, as you'll soon see, is the most creative act your brain performs. When you try to remember, you imagine your mind opening a box. Inside, you expect to find the moment as it once was, untouched, preserved, safe. But the truth is, gentler and stranger, there is no box. There's only the act of rebuilding. Each recollection is a fresh construction. Your brain doesn't play memories like videos. It performs them like theater. The stage is your hippocampus, the actors are your neurons, and the script, well, that changes a little each time. Picture it. Deep within your brain, a network lights up like a constellation. The hippocampus reaches out to distant cortical regions, calling on them to provide fragments, sounds, smells, sensations, emotions. Each arrive separately, like dancers entering from the wings. Slowly, the fragments synchronize into a scene. The scent of rain drifts in from one region, the shape of a face from another, the sound of a laugh from yet another. Together, they form the illusion of a single, complete memory. But even as the brain rebuilds, it edits. Every recall activates the machinery of reconsolidation, the process that allows the past to be subtly rewritten. Each time neurons fire to reassemble a memory, they briefly become unstable, as though the connections loosen their grip. In that window of fragility, new information can slip in, what you've learned since, how you feel now, what you wish had been true. And when the memory settles again, these new elements have been woven into its fabric. This is why memories evolve, why an argument from years ago might over time lose its anger and gain a sense of understanding, why a childhood humiliation can soften into a story of resilience. The neural pathways that store these experiences are living tissue. They adapt, they merge, they let the present reinterpret the past, so that your story still makes sense. It's stut's not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The brain was never designed to be a recorder. It's a predictor. Its job is to prepare you for what comes next, not to preserve what came before. So when you remember, your brain asks, what part of this memory is useful now? What can it teach? What can it justify? What can it protect? And then it rebuilds the past accordingly. Think of an archaeologist restoring an ancient vase. The fragments are real, but the spaces between them are guesses. The archaeologist fills the gaps with new material, resin, pigment, reconstruction, to create a whole object again. Your brain does the same. The reconstructed memory feels complete, because your mind despises incompleteness. It would rather invent than leave a hole. In laboratories, this has been shown again and again. When people recall lists of words, faces, or stories, they often add details that were never there. They do it unconsciously, with absolute confidence. The hippocampus fills the gaps with what should have been there, based on pattern and expectation. The brain's narrative instinct overrides the need for precision. But beneath the science lies a tender truth. This constant rewriting is an act of care. Your mind is not betraying you, it's protecting you from fragmentation. To remember perfectly would mean to relive pain perfectly too. So the brain compromises, it bends memory until it fits the emotional architecture you can survive. And in that bending lies beauty. The flexibility of memory allows forgiveness, growth, reinterpretation. Without it, your identity would be rigid, frozen in past versions of yourself that no longer exist. Imagine if every mistake you made, every heartbreak, every regret stayed unchangeable, etched in neural stone. You would be unable to move forward. You couldn't forgive because the pain would never fade. You couldn't learn because the lesson would never evolve. Instead, your brain reworks the story. It turns pain into insight. It turns chaos into sequence. It turns the unbearable into something that can be remembered without breaking you. In that way, remembering is an act of mercy. Your mind rehearses what happened not to preserve it, but to make it livable. And that rehearsal has rhythm. As you remember, your pulse slows, your breathing adjusts, your eyes move in small, involuntary motions. These are echoes of the original event, reenacted in miniature. Memory is a body process as much as a mental one. Your heart participates, your muscles recall postures long forgotten, your senses join the performance. That's why a smell, a melody, or a photograph can collapse. Time. These sensory cues don't just remind you, they reactivate you. The same neural circuits that fired during the original experience stir again. For an instant, the past and present blur, and you exist in both. You might feel it as a shiver, or a sudden warmth, or an ache beneath the ribs. It's not nostalgia exactly, it's the living proof that memory is not storage but resurrection. But resurrection has a price. Each time a memory rises, it risks distortion. The brain doesn't restore from a perfect archive. It paints from memory of the memory. The colors fade, the lines shift. Still, you believe it. You have to. It's what allows your story to hold together. So next time you say, "I remember exactly how it happened," pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what if that certainty is just another reconstruction, an echo that feels whole because your brain made it so? The science of recall reveals not the weakness of memory, but its brilliance. It keeps rewriting the world so you can keep living in it. And if the mind rebuilds the past each time you remember, what guides its edits? What decides which details to keep and which to let dissolve like mist? To find that answer, we need to meet the quiet force behind every reconstruction, the one that decides what version of the truth survives. Emotion. You recall a moment that mattered, maybe a conversation that ended everything, or the day you first felt truly seen. The words, the faces, the setting, they're vivid at first. But as you hold the image in your mind, something starts to shift. The details soften. A new shade of meaning appears. You're not just remembering, you're feeling the memory. And that feeling quietly changes the picture. Inside your brain, emotion is the hidden hand guiding recall. It decides what stays bright and what fades into the background. When a memory is retrieved, the hippocampus calls on the amygdala, the small almond-shaped sentinel that guards your emotional life. If the amygdala senses emotional charge, it releases neurochemicals that mark the memory as important. But important doesn't always mean accurate. It means alive. When you remember something joyful, the amygdala colors it with warmth. Dopamine flows through your neural pathways, enhancing connections that feel rewarding. Over time, those circuits strengthen, making the memory easier to recall. The brain is telling you, this felt good, seek it again. But when the memory is painful, cortisol and norepinephrine flood the same networks. branding the event with urgency. The message then becomes, "This hurt, avoid it." In both cases, emotion sculpts the story. It doesn't record, it repaints. Imagine standing in front of a canvas you've been painting for years. Each emotion adds a new layer. Joy leaves light strokes of gold. Fear presses darker pigments. Sadness blurs the edges. The original image lies somewhere beneath, but you'll never see it again without its emotional overlays. That's what your mind does. It turns moments into emotional mosaics. And here's the strange part. The more emotion you feel while recalling something, the more likely that memory will change. Because every time an emotional memory is reactivated, it becomes vulnerable to alteration. This is why trauma therapy, for example, doesn't erase pain, it rewires it. When someone revisits a painful memory in a safe setting, their brain opens the old circuit, re-experiences the emotion, and then gradually replaces fear with calm. The past doesn't vanish, but its emotional weight transforms. You do this unconsciously all the time. Think of an old heartbreak. Years later, when you remember it, you no longer feel the same sharp ache. Instead, there's a kind of bittersweet nostalgia. Your brain has edited the memory, not the facts, but the feeling tone. The story remains, but the emotional lighting has shifted. This interplay between memory and emotion is ancient, long before language. Emotion told the brain what mattered. It still does. Every sensory input, sight, sound, touch, passes through emotional filters before it's stored. Only the experiences that stir feeling are prioritized for long-term memory. That's why you can recall where you were when something extraordinary happened, yet forget what you had for breakfast 3 days ago. Emotion decides what becomes part of your personal mythology, and sometimes it lies beautifully. You may remember a place as brighter than it was, a person kinder, a sorrow deeper. These are emotional exaggerations, distortions that serve a purpose. They help the brain create meaning, because the mind's true goal isn't precision, it's narrative. It wants the past to feel coherent, even if that means reshaping it. Emotion, then, is the editor-in-chief of your autobiography. It decides which scenes deserve more light and which fade into the background. It amplifies patterns that align with who you believe you are now, trimming those that don't. That's why when you grow, your memories grow with you. They're reinterpreted through new emotional lenses. Consider this: a childhood scolding that once felt humiliating may later feel instructive. A failure that once burned with shame becomes a turning point you're grateful for. Nothing in the external world changed. The neurons did. The emotional context was rewritten. It's a delicate equilibrium. Without emotion, memory would be a sterile archive, but with too much emotion, it becomes a maze of distortions. The brain must continually balance intensity with coherence, shaping a narrative that feels stable enough to live within. That's also why emotion can deceive. Under strong feelings, fear, anger, grief, the amygdala can overpower the hippocampus, pushing raw sensation ahead of fact. You might remember someone's tone as harsher than it was, or recall events that align with your mood rather than reality. This is not dishonesty, it's biology. Your brain prioritizes emotional truth over literal accuracy. When you think about it, emotion is the storyteller of evolution. It kept our ancestors alive by exaggerating threats and rewards. Today, it keeps us human by weaving feelings into memory so that life makes sense. We don't just remember events, we remember how they made us feel, because feeling is what helps us decide what matters. And when you close your eyes tonight and let your thoughts drift backward, the emotions that rise first will be your map. They'll show you not what happened, but what still lives in you. But emotion doesn't just sculpt memory from the inside, it interacts with something deeper. The brain's desire for consistency. Your mind will twist facts, mute contradictions, and invent connections just to protect the fragile harmony between who you were and who you are. That deeper instinct to prefer coherence over truth is where memory's illusion becomes its masterpiece. There is a quiet rule your brain lives by. It would rather be consistent than correct. When emotion colors a memory, the mind bends around it, polishing away the rough edges that don't fit your present identity. It's not deceit, it's survival. Your memories must agree with your current story, or your sense of self begins to fracture. Imagine standing before a vast mosaic of your life. Each tile is a moment, laughter, loss, the weight of a decision. Over the years, the pattern has changed, not because the tiles have moved, but because you keep rearranging the meaning between them. You shift one piece slightly to the left, brighten another, dim a few that no longer fit the theme. That's what coherence looks like inside the brain, a self-portrait constantly retouched, never quite finished. Deep beneath your conscious awareness, a network of regions works tirelessly to maintain that portrait. The medial prefrontal cortex helps integrate memory with self-concept, ensuring that new recollections don't contradict the person you believe yourself to be. The posterior cingulate, a kind of mental mirror, compares incoming memories against your ongoing narrative, smoothing inconsistencies before you ever notice them. Together, these systems create the illusion of continuity, the comforting sense that you have always been the same person, looking out through the same eyes. But continuity is a performance. In truth, every time you remember, the brain subtly adjusts the story so that your past self doesn't embarrass your present one. It edits dialogue, swaps emotions, even recasts supporting characters. You remember what you would have felt if you were the person you are now. Think of how you recall your teenage self, the anxieties, the impulses, the certainties that once seemed absolute. Today they feel distant, almost foreign. Yet your mind stitches a thread of identity between that person and this one, smoothing over contradictions. You say, "I've grown," but you also say, "I've always been like this, deep down." Both can't be entirely true. The brain allows them to coexist because coherence feels safer than fragmentation. This drive for harmony is so powerful that it can rewrite facts. In experiments, people shown fabricated photographs of themselves performing an act they never did, say taking a hot air balloon ride, often come to remember it vividly after repeated exposure. The image fits neatly into their narrative of self-discovery or adventure, and the brain accepts it. Once the emotional context aligns with identity, belief follows. Coherence, then, is not about truth. It's about narrative stability. You need to feel that your life makes sense, that every step led logically to the next. Without that illusion, motivation erodes. You'd wake each day feeling disassembled. So the brain keeps the story tidy, even if it must invent transitions to do so. You've probably felt this during moments of self-reflection. Perhaps after a heartbreak or a failure, you look back and realize the signs were always there. You tell yourself you should have known. But that foresight is an illusion, a reconstruction that aligns the past with the clarity of the present. The story feels cleaner that way. The mind prefers symmetry to chaos. It's not all deception, though. This flexibility gives your psyche resilience. When life contradicts your expectations, coherence helps you adapt. The mind quietly updates the narrative so that events still fit into a meaningful arc. I lost that job, but it taught me what I truly value. In truth, the lesson came later. The memory has been rewritten to justify the wisdom. The brain edits to heal. Philosophers once called this the rationalizing mind. Neuroscientists call it the confabulating brain. The difference is only vocabulary. Both describe a system that weaves causality into coincidence, purpose into accident, until life feels narratively whole. We are not creatures of fact, we are creatures of meaning. This is why two people can share an experience and remember entirely different stories. Their emotional filters and identities sculpt different versions of the same event. Ask siblings about their childhood and you'll hear two parallel realities, both sincere, both selective. Each brain has sculpted coherence from chaos, and neither version is wrong. They're simply true enough to live by. Yet sometimes, this need for consistency becomes a trap. When the mind must protect a fragile identity, it can distort memory so deeply that it denies contradiction altogether. A person who sees themselves as kind may genuinely forget moments of cruelty. Another who believes they are unlovable may recall rejection where there was none. These aren't lies, they are neural defenses, truth filtered through the lens of coherence. If you could see the brain in those moments, it would resemble a painter obsessively retouching a portrait, blending colors, softening lines, removing strokes that feel wrong. The painting isn't fake, it's idealized. But there's a cost. The more the brain edits for coherence, the more it drifts from precision. Over time, the mosaic of memory becomes a beautiful distortion, truer to who you believe you are than to what actually occurred. Still, that distortion has a function. It gives you a sense of authorship. You need to believe your story has direction, that your past leads to your present with purpose. Coherence is the mind's way of assuring you that your life isn't just a sequence of disconnected events, but a narrative that deserves to be told. And yet, somewhere beneath the polish, there's a quiet tension. The self that was and the self that remembers are not the same. They're like overlapping transparencies, aligned just enough to appear whole. That tension is the next mystery, because if each memory is rebuilt to match the person recalling it, then who exactly is doing the remembering? Is it possible that every act of recall creates a new version of you, slightly altered, slightly more coherent, slightly less original? To find out, we must meet that other presence within, the traveler who moves through time, not by distance, but by remembering. You sit in silence for a moment, wondering who exactly is remembering your life right now. It feels obvious you are, but which version of you? The one who lived the moment, or the one looking back through layers of time? Because each time you recall an experience, the person doing the remembering is not the same person who first lived it. Inside your mind, time does not flow like a river. It folds. Every recollection is a point where past and present meet, where the self you were touches the self you have become. That meeting is never neutral. The present self always wins. It reshapes the memory in its own image, filtering it through the beliefs, desires, and emotions of now. Neuroscience calls this temporal self-projection. The brain regions responsible for imagining the future, the medial prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, are the very same regions that help you recall the past. To your brain, remembering and imagining are not different acts but different directions on the same neural highway. Each memory is a simulation, rebuilt from fragments to serve the present moment. Think of your mind as an ever-updating archive. You open a file labeled Childhood Summer or The Day I Fell in Love. The text inside changes slightly every time you read it. The ink responds to your emotional weather. Some lines fade, others darken. By the time you close the file, it no longer describes what happened. It describes what you now believe happened. This is why certain memories evolve alongside you. The older you grow, the more meaning they gather, like stones polished by water. The embarrassment that once made you blush becomes endearing. The fear that paralyzed you turns into a lesson you tell others. Your brain is constantly rewriting the past to maintain psychological balance between who you were and who you are. But this flexibility is not a weakness, it's how identity stays alive. Imagine if your mind froze every moment exactly as it was. You'd be trapped in a museum of outdated selves. The angry version, the naive version, the grieving version, all static, all eternal. Growth would be impossible. So the brain keeps revisiting the exhibits, updating the displays, blending the old with the new. In that sense, remembering is not about returning, it's about integration. Philosophers have long sensed this paradox. You never step in the same river twice, wrote Heraclitus. Neuroscience now whispers the same. You never remember the same memory twice. Each act of recall subtly alters the neural riverbed, redirecting the flow for next time. The self, then, is not a noun, it's a verb, a process unfolding moment by moment, memory by memory. Still, this raises an unsettling thought. If the self keeps changing, what anchors you? What keeps the thread unbroken between all your different versions? The answer lies in a deeper rhythm. a continuity of emotion. Even as the facts shift, the emotional tone of your story tends to stay constant. The feelings of joy, sorrow, longing, or love that accompany your memories form a kind of signature melody. They're the refrain that lets you recognize yourself through time, even when the verses have changed. Consider a melody played by different instruments across the years, sometimes bright and clear, sometimes distant and muffled, but always recognizable. That's your emotional continuity. It's the song beneath your shifting story, the through line of your personal symphony. Without it, identity would unravel completely. Yet emotion does more than connect you to your past. It also prepares you for the future. The same networks that reconstruct memories are activated when you imagine what's ahead. In that sense, you are constantly rehearsing your life, both backward and forward. The future self you picture today will one day look back and call this moment memory. The loop never closes, it only tightens. You can feel this when nostalgia hits unexpectedly. A song plays, a scent drifts by, and suddenly you're in two times at once. Your brain has collapsed decades into seconds. The present self reaches out to touch the ghost of who you were, and for an instant the boundary dissolves. That bittersweet ache is the awareness of being both observer and participant, someone who remembers and someone who is remembered. There's tenderness in that, because every act of remembering is, in a quiet way, an act of forgiveness. You're forgiving the earlier versions of yourself for not knowing what you know now. You're giving them context, letting them rest inside a story that makes sense. That's how the self evolves, not by rejecting the past, but by rewriting it with compassion. Still, this constant rewriting comes at a cost. The more fluid your memories, the easier it becomes for illusion to slip in unnoticed. Your mind can rewrite guilt into justification, or doubt into certainty. Sometimes that helps you heal. Other times it builds myths that isolate you from truth. And that's where the paradox deepens. The same process that allows growth also allows self-deception. The mechanism that lets you move forward can also lead you astray. The traveler within you, revisiting old moments, can either rewrite with wisdom or with bias. To understand how that traveler works, we must look closer at the machinery that allows it to rewrite so easily, the very cells that hold your past and reshape it with every recall. The process is small, microscopic, but its consequences echo through every moment you call your life. Because inside that fleeting neural act, when a memory trembles, becomes unstable, and then resettles, you can glimpse the most intimate secret of consciousness itself, the brain's ability to edit reality. That is the next threshold, where biology meets philosophy, and where the science of reconsolidation begins to reveal how fragile and how miraculous remembering truly is. You might imagine your memories as solid stones stacked neatly along the path of your life, but in truth, they're more like dew, forming, dissolving, reforming in new shapes every time the light touches them. That light is awareness, and every glance reshapes the surface. When neuroscientists speak of reconsolidation, they're describing something astonishingly intimate, the brain's ability to open a stored memory, rewrite its emotional code, and save it again as if it were the original. It's not metaphor, it's mechanics. The past is editable because your neurons are living, changeable cells, constantly pruning, reconnecting, adapting. Inside your hippocampus, where experience first takes form, each event is represented as a network of neurons firing together. When you recall it, those same neurons reignite in a similar pattern. But this reactivation is not mere playback, it's recreation. For a short time, the molecular bonds that stabilize the memory loosen. The proteins holding those connections dissolve slightly, allowing new information, new context, emotion, or meaning to slip in. Then, as the memory refreezes, the updated version takes its place. This is reconsolidation, a biological rewriting process. It's how new learning merges with old learning, how healing can literally reshape pain, how the mind integrates the present into the past. Think of it like revising a story written in ink that softens whenever you read it. Each reading gives you a brief chance to amend the narrative. You can change the tone, reframe the message, soften the tragedy. The memory remains, but its essence evolves. You might wonder why evolution designed such a fragile system. Wouldn't a fixed archive be safer, more reliable? But life doesn't reward accuracy, it rewards adaptability. Your ancestors survived, not by remembering every detail, but by remembering what mattered. A flexible memory lets you update your understanding of the world, replacing outdated fears or attachments with information that fits the present moment. This is why therapy works. When someone revisits a painful memory in a calm, supportive environment, the emotional charge that once anchored that memory begins to dissolve. The same neural circuit that once linked the event to fear now pairs it with safety. When the memory reconsolidates, it carries a different emotional weight. The story hasn't vanished. It's been retold in a way that no longer harms. Even ordinary experiences follow this rule. When you recall a mistake and think, "I wouldn't do that now," you are not merely reflecting, you are editing. You are inserting your current wisdom into the old scene. The next time you remember it, that wisdom will already be there, woven into the recollection. The mind quietly updates the file to include growth. It's a humbling thought. Each act of recall is a moment of neurobiological vulnerability. In that brief window, your brain is rewriting the architecture of your identity. What you choose to focus on, resentment or understanding, shame or learning, determines the version of the past you'll carry forward. And yet, this process doesn't always serve you. The same mechanism that heals can also harden pain. When you recall an event with anger or fear, you strengthen those emotional links. The brain doesn't judge context, it simply reinforces whatever pattern is active. Recall becomes rehearsal. A thought repeated with emotion becomes a neural habit. So memory reconsolidation is a double-edged instrument. It can free you or trap you, depending on how you engage it. Your attention is the sculptor's hand. It can smooth the contours of pain into understanding or carve them deeper. Visualize it for a moment. In the darkness of your mind, a network of glowing filaments flickers. They connect, disconnect, reconnect, like fireflies rearranging themselves into new constellations. Each spark is a neuron firing in response to a remembered moment. When you focus with compassion, those lights settle into softer, more harmonious patterns. When you focus with bitterness, they cluster into knots. Your memories, quite literally, change shape under the pressure of feeling. This fluidity makes you both fragile and free. You are never entirely who you were yesterday, because your neural map has already redrawn itself overnight. Even your dreams contribute to this redrafting, replaying fragments of experience to integrate them into a story that feels whole. The self you awaken as is slightly restructured, slightly new. It's tempting to see this as instability, but maybe it's evolution at its most personal scale. You are a living experiment in adaptation, a being that edits its own history to survive emotionally, not just biologically. Every recollection, every reflection, every retelling of your past is an act of evolution. Still, a question lingers beneath this understanding. If the brain is constantly rewriting the past, how can you ever trust your memories? What does truth even mean when the evidence of your own life changes with every thought? Perhaps truth in this context isn't about accuracy but alignment, the degree to which your memories serve your growth, your empathy, your continuity. The mind is not a historian, it's a novelist, and like any good novelist, it edits the plot so the reader, the present you, can understand the meaning. As you sit here thinking of the moments that shaped you, notice how your body responds. The chest loosens or tightens, the breath quickens or slows. That's reconsolidation happening in real time, biology and meaning merging. And as you exhale, the neurons settle again, saving this updated version of the story you call your life. But if the brain can so elegantly edit the past, what happens when it edits too far, when the distinction between truth and fiction begins to dissolve completely? To answer that, we must step into the realm of illusion, into the strange space where memory betrays its maker. There's a moment in every life when you feel sure of what happened, utterly sure. You remember the words, the faces, the sequence. You'd swear you could testify before a court of memory itself. And yet, science whispers a quieter truth, that certainty may be the most convincing illusion the brain ever performs. Because if reconsolidation makes memory fluid, it also makes it vulnerable. Every time you recall an event, the neural door opens for revision, and not always by your choice. New information, suggestion, even imagination can drift in and take root as though it had always been there. What was once solid fact becomes soft clay. The brain, so careful in its architecture, has no built-in watermark for truth. A recalled image and an imagined one activate nearly identical neural pathways. The same regions of the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and visual association areas light up whether you are remembering or imagining. To the brain, both are experiences. The distinction between memory and imagination isn't structural, it's emotional. If it feels real, the brain files it as real. Consider the phenomenon of false memory, one of neuroscience's most haunting discoveries. In classic experiments, researchers showed participants a list of related words like bed, rest, dream, pillow, tired. Later, when asked to recall the list, many confidently added the word sleep, a word that was never shown. The brain, seeking coherence, filled the gap. The invented memory felt authentic because it fit the emotional pattern. And it goes further. In studies using manipulated photographs, participants were shown doctored images of themselves performing impossible acts, riding in a hot air balloon, shaking hands with a celebrity. After a few exposures, many not only believed the images but recalled details, what the air felt like, who laughed nearby, what they were thinking at the time. Their brains built new memories around suggestion, weaving fiction into the neural fabric of their identity. This is the dark twin of reconsolidation. The same mechanism that lets you heal can also make you misremember. When a new detail feels emotionally consistent with your sense of self or story, the brain welcomes it. Emotion grants permission, and the past updates accordingly. It's easy to see how this can shape entire histories. A family recalls an event differently. Over time, they harmonize their versions, merging them into one shared story. A culture repeats a collective narrative so often that it becomes its truth. Memory is social. It syncs across people through language, repetition, and emotion, and every retelling strengthens the illusion of accuracy. But individually, this process feels deeply personal. You might revisit a memory with a friend and realize your versions don't match. They remember rain, you remember sun. They recall laughter, you recall tension. Who is right? Perhaps both, because each of you stored the moment through your own network of emotions. Each of you rewrote it according to what you needed to believe. Neuroscientists have found that even within a single person, confidence in memory is a poor predictor of accuracy. The prefrontal cortex evaluates how sure you feel, but it doesn't verify facts. It measures fluency, how easily the memory comes to mind. The smoother the recall, the truer it feels. Familiarity masquerades as truth. And this illusion is not malicious. It's the mind's way of simplifying existence. The brain can't store every nuance of every event, so it compresses, summarizes, fills in blanks. But compression inevitably alters the original image. Like a photograph saved over and over, each version loses a little definition. Eventually, you remember remembering, not the moment itself. Philosophically, this fragility reveals something profound. Truth is not a static object buried in the past. It's a living negotiation between fact and feeling. Your memories are the drafts of that negotiation, revised continuously by emotion, belief, and need. Still, the realization can be unsettling. If memory is this malleable, what anchors you to what's real? The answer might be humility, the understanding that your mind is a storyteller, not an archivist. Every story it tells is sincere, even when it's wrong. And perhaps sincerity, not accuracy, is what defines authenticity in a human life. Because the same neural pathways that allow false memory also make empathy possible. When you imagine another person's pain or joy, you activate the same regions used for remembering your own. The boundary between your experience and another's blurs. Your ability to misremember is the twin of your ability to understand. So while memory can betray, it also connects. It lets you see the world not as it is, but as it feels, a shared projection shaped by countless human minds, each editing and re-editing the story of reality. Still, beneath this poetic unity lies a question science cannot quite answer. If the brain constantly reconstructs both memory and meaning, then where does you truly exist? In the original moment, long gone, or in the reconstruction you carry now? To approach that question, we must venture deeper into the brain's physical archive, to the structure that makes remembering possible at all, and yet, paradoxically, ensures that no memory ever remains untouched. The hippocampus, the quiet archivist, endlessly rewriting the story it's sworn to preserve. Deep within your temporal lobes lies a structure that resembles two seahorses curled toward each other, the hippocampi. Their name comes from the Greek for sea monster, but what they guard is far more delicate than treasure. They are the custodians of your lived experience, endlessly transforming sensation into story. Each moment you live, a face, a smell, a sound, arrives in fragments. The hippocampus gathers them and binds them together into a single trace. Scientists call this pattern completion, the act of weaving scattered data into one coherent scene. It's the brain's first draft of memory, a fragile tapestry strung together by electrical whispers. When the moment passes, that trace begins to settle into long-term networks across your cortex. But the hippocampus never really lets go. It remains the bridge between now and then, the scribe who keeps rewriting the archive every time you turn back the pages. In the quiet of its circuits, neurons spark in rhythmic bursts, oscillating in patterns known as theta waves. These waves are like the brushstrokes of the mind, coordinating the timing of neurons so they can replay the pattern of an experience. During wakefulness, the hippocampus encodes. During rest, it replays, and in sleep, particularly during slow wave and REM cycles, it whispers those patterns outward, training the cortex to remember. But here's the secret: replay is never identical. Each reactivation is colored by what's changed, since the emotions you've processed, the lessons you've learned, even the state of your body as you sleep. The hippocampus adjusts accordingly, restitching the pattern to match the new you. That's why memories feel familiar, but never fixed. Imagine a librarian who loves her books so much that she can't resist editing them each time they're borrowed. She tidies a paragraph here, clarifies a metaphor there, softens a painful scene so the reader won't flinch. Over the years, the stories evolve, not dishonestly, but gently, to remain relevant. That librarian is your hippocampus. This small, curved structure holds the blueprint of your autobiographical self. Damage it, and the continuity of time collapses. Without a functioning hippocampus, you can perceive the present but cannot store it. Moments fall through you like water through fingers. You become an eternal now, awake but unanchored. And yet, the hippocampus is not a vault. It's a workshop. It works in harmony with other regions. The amygdala adds emotional intensity. The prefrontal cortex provides narrative order. The parietal regions supply context and spatial detail. Together, they form a storytelling network, one that doesn't just store life, but interprets it. This is why your memories are filled with meaning rather than mere data. The hippocampus doesn't simply record, it asks, what does this mean for me? Every encoded scene passes through that filter of significance. It's why certain moments etch deeply: the first heartbreak, the birth of a child, the instant of danger, while others blur into the background. Emotional salience decides what the hippocampus prioritizes for long-term preservation. But the hippocampus is also imaginative. When you picture the future, it activates the same neural pathways it uses to recall the past. It doesn't distinguish between memory and imagination. Both are simulations built from the same materials. The mind rehearses what might be by rearranging what has been. You are always practicing life in advance, building potential tomorrows from rearranged yesterdays. This dual role, remembering and imagining, reveals a subtle truth. The hippocampus is not a keeper of history, but a generator of possibility. It ensures that your identity isn't static, it's iterative. You don't merely recall who you were, you rehearse who you're becoming. Still, the hippocampus pays a price for this creativity. Its malleability makes it vulnerable to stress, trauma, and emotional overload. High levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, can damage its delicate neurons, shrinking its volume over time. That's why prolonged anxiety or grief can blur your sense of chronology. Your hippocampus struggles to bind events together coherently. The story of your life loses order, days blending into each other like watercolor in the rain. Yet even here, there is resilience. The hippocampus can regenerate neurons, a rare phenomenon called neurogenesis. New cells bloom in its dentate gyrus, forming new pathways, restoring the mind's ability to learn, imagine, and adapt. It's as if the librarian rebuilds her shelves overnight, ready to keep rewriting the story at dawn. Understanding this small structure changes the way you see yourself. Every act of reflection, every piece of art, every dream or plan involves its unseen labor. It is the quiet link between who you were, who you are, and who you might still become. But memory is not all harmony. Beside the hippocampus lives a smaller, fiercer companion, the amygdala. Where the hippocampus organizes experience, the amygdala decides what deserves emotional thunder. It colors the archive with fear, joy, longing, and grief. It decides which memories glow and which burn. And as you'll see next, this fiery twin doesn't just influence what you remember, it decides how deeply those memories live in you. If the hippocampus is the librarian of your life, then the amygdala is its heartbeat, raw, emotional, unfiltered, nestled deep within the temporal lobe. This small, almond-shaped structure doesn't wait for thought or reason. It feels first, thinks later, and every memory that passes through it is branded by emotion before it ever reaches the archive. When you experience something intense, a near accident, a kiss that changes everything, a moment of public shame, your amygdala surges into action. It floods the brain with chemical messengers, adrenaline to heighten alertness, norepinephrine to sharpen attention, and cortisol to fix the emotional weight of the experience in memory. These substances whisper to the hippocampus, "Remember this, this matters." That's why you can recall the smallest details from moments of fear or ecstasy, the texture of the floor, the temperature of the air, the rhythm of your heartbeat. Emotion acts like glue, binding sensory fragments into vivid recollections. But that same glue can distort the shape of what it preserves. Under stress, the amygdala amplifies feeling while the hippocampus struggles to record sequence or context. You remember how it felt more than what actually happened. This is why traumatic memories are often fragmented. The amygdala's alarm drowns out the hippocampus's sense of order. The event is encoded as a burst of sensations, sound, color, movement, disconnected from time. Later, when triggered, these fragments resurface not as stories but as flashes, the smell of smoke, a sudden panic, the pulse of an old fear. The body remembers even when the narrative doesn't. Yet the amygdala is not your enemy. It's your evolutionary guardian, the reason your ancestors survived long enough to pass on their genes. By searing the emotional essence of danger into memory, it teaches the organism what to avoid. Likewise, by amplifying joy and connection, it teaches what to seek. The amygdala makes learning personal. Its influence extends beyond fear. When you feel love, gratitude, or belonging, the amygdala collaborates with other emotional centers, particularly the ventral striatum and orbit of frontal cortex, to tag those moments as rewarding. These memories become emotional anchors, helping you recognize what safety and connection feel like. Your brain doesn't just want to survive, it wants to return to the places and people that make survival beautiful. In this sense, the amygdala and hippocampus work in a duet. One adds color, the other shape. One feels, the other remembers. When balanced, they produce memories that are both vivid and coherent, But when emotion overwhelms logic, or when logic suppresses emotion, the duet falls out of tune. You either drown in feeling or drift into detachment. This delicate balance explains why the same event can be remembered differently depending on mood. A breakup recalled in sorrow feels like tragedy. Recalled in gratitude, it becomes transformation. The factual memory hasn't changed. The amygdala's tone has. Your emotional state, when you revisit a memory, determines which version you will strengthen through reconsolidation. It's almost as if each memory contains two layers, one made of events, another made of emotion. The first records what happened. The second records how it felt. And with time, the second layer often becomes the dominant one. You might forget the specifics of a day long past, yet still carry the warmth or ache it left behind. The amygdala ensures that emotion outlives detail. But there's another side to this power. When the amygdala becomes hyperactive through chronic stress, trauma, or anxiety, it can hijack the process entirely. The brain begins to over-prioritize threat, reinforcing fearful memories and ignoring neutral ones. Every shadow feels heavier, every silence hides danger. The archive becomes distorted, a history written in adrenaline. Healing, then, is not about erasing those memories, but rebalancing the duet. Through safety, repetition, and sometimes therapy, the hippocampus learns to retell the story while the amygdala gradually softens its alarm. The emotional tone shifts from survival to understanding. It's as if the music of memory modulates from minor to major without changing its melody. The most fascinating part is that joy works the same way. When you experience happiness, the amygdala collaborates with the brain's reward system to strengthen the circuit of pleasure. The next time you encounter something similar, those neurons light up more easily. Emotion primes the mind for repetition, whether that emotion is fear or love. And so, over a lifetime, the amygdala sculpts your personality as much as your experiences do. It decides what stays vivid, what fades, and what defines you. Your emotional memories, the scent of rain before a long-awaited reunion, the tremor in your voice during a confession, the ache of parting, are the notes that compose the symphony of self. But emotion's influence reaches even further. It doesn't just determine what you remember, it shapes how you tell the story. The amygdala guides the narrative tone of your personal mythology, turning facts into feelings and experiences into meaning. And that meaning has a purpose, because the brain, for all its complexity, is also an artist. It seeks not accuracy, but beauty in coherence. It weaves emotion and memory together until they create a story worth living in, one that explains why you love, why you fear, and why you keep moving forward. Still, there's a cost to this artistry. The same emotion that enriches memory can also enslave it. When feelings grow too strong, they can trap you in the past, replaying a loop of fear, loss, or longing. To understand how the brain escapes that loop, how it transforms raw emotion into story and story into wisdom, we need to step into its narrative core, the storyteller itself, the mind that binds every fragment into you. There's a point in every recollection where you stop seeing the memory and start telling it. That subtle transition from image to interpretation is the moment when the storyteller inside you takes control. It's not a voice you hear, but a network that hums quietly behind thought, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the angular gyrus, and parts of the temporal lobe working together like authors in a shared library. Their purpose is not simply to remember, but to make sense. The human brain cannot bear disconnected fragments. It must turn them into narrative. When the hippocampus sends the rough material of memory, sensations, sequences, feelings, forward, the prefrontal cortex begins its work. It edits, it structures, it asks questions, like a writer revising drafts. What is the cause? What is the meaning? How does this fit into who I am now? In those milliseconds of neural dialogue, your experience becomes story. Storytelling is how your brain keeps the illusion of self continuous. You are not the sum of what has happened to you. You are the story you tell about what has happened to you. The narrative self, this seamless sense of me, is the brain's most enduring creation. Philosophically, it's a fragile kind of magic. Every time you remember, you aren't just recalling, you're rewriting the protagonist. The I that narrates today's memory is subtly different from the I that lived it. Yet your mind folds them together, blurring the line until the story feels like one unbroken thread. This is why two people can live through the same event and come away with entirely different meanings. Their inner narrators select different arcs. One frames the experience as betrayal, the other as liberation. Neither version is false. Each is the brain's attempt to organize chaos into coherence. Inside your cortex, this process resembles a living conversation. The medial prefrontal regions handle self-relevance, linking memories to your identity. The angular gyrus integrates sensory and emotional data into language-like sequences. The default mode network, active when your mind wanders, stitches these threads together, rehearsing and refining your personal myths, even when you aren't aware. At night, when you lie in darkness and the brain begins its quiet drift, this storyteller continues its work. It revises memories from the day, smoothing rough transitions, trimming emotional excess. Dreams are part of that editing process, surreal drafts that test how old memories fit into new ones. They are your mind's experiments in narrative coherence. This editing impulse has a purpose beyond comfort. It's how the brain learns. To extract lessons, you must first create a storyline. This happened because of that. In doing so, you turn experience into prediction. The past becomes a guide for the future. That's why your memories rarely feel static. They're constantly being updated to remain instructive. But there's danger in that same mechanism. The storyteller loves simplicity. It smooths contradictions and omits details that complicate the moral. Over time, nuance erodes. You begin to believe in the story's rhythm more than in its raw truth. I always knew it would end this way. You tell yourself, forgetting that once you had no idea. This tendency is what psychologists call the narrative bias, the compulsion to perceive life as a plot. It's comforting to think everything fits, that each sorrow leads to a revelation, each mistake to growth. But in serving meaning, the storyteller sometimes sacrifices reality. It's a trade the brain is willing to make, because coherence feels safer than chaos. Yet this very act of fabrication makes human consciousness what it is. The ability to construct a story from fragments, to find cause, emotion, and moral in the random flow of events, is what allows empathy, art, and civilization. We share stories to align our minds, to create shared meaning where none existed. From a neuroscientific view, every conversation, every confession, every memory, retold aloud, strengthens neural pathways of identity. The more you narrate your life, the more consistent it feels, even when the details drift. The act of telling solidifies belief. Words are how neurons rehearse themselves into conviction. Imagine a memory as a piece of glass, and each retelling as a breath against it. Over time the surface fogs, not from error but from use. You can still see through it, but what you see is tinted by warmth, by repetition, by need. That's the storyteller's touch, not deception but devotion. Sometimes the brain even invents new scenes to close open loops. When something unresolved lingers, a question, a regret, a wound, your mind creates a conclusion so the story can move on. That's how forgiveness often begins, not with external change, but with an internal rewrite that makes peace possible. But the storyteller's influence doesn't end with memory. It extends into imagination. When you plan, hope, or fear, you're writing future chapters in advance. The same circuits that construct the past are projecting possibilities forward. You are constantly revising both timelines, shaping who you were and who you might be. This realization is both humbling and freeing. You are not trapped by your history. You are its author. The same creativity that once distorted truth in fear can now reshape it in wisdom. The brain that edits to survive can also edit to heal. Still, one question lingers beneath the quiet hum of this inner author. If your mind constantly revises your memories, how much of what you believe about yourself is invention? To approach that question, We must explore where the boundaries of reality truly begin to blur, where emotion and imagination conspire to create memories that never happened at all. That's the paradox of the remembering brain. It lies not out of malice, but out of love for the story it must keep telling. Close your eyes for a moment and summon a powerful memory, one that still carries a pulse. Perhaps the first time you felt truly understood, or the instant your heart broke in a way that changed you forever. You can almost feel the atmosphere of it, the texture of the air, the way the light fell, the rhythm of your breathing. What you're doing now is something the brain was built to do exquisitely well: link emotion to memory. It's how we prioritize meaning in a world too vast to record in full. Deep inside your skull, nestled like a quiet ember beside the hippocampus, your amygdala stirs again. It doesn't just store the feeling, it decides how brightly it should burn each time you return to it. The amygdala's job is to amplify what matters, but its definition of matter isn't moral, it's biological. What helped you survive or connect becomes sacred in its code. What once hurt deeply becomes marked in red ink. It cannot afford to forget, and so it tags experiences with emotional charge, instructing the hippocampus to keep them ready to replay, to refeel, to learn from. In this collaboration, memory and emotion become inseparable, but they operate like two lenses, adjusting focus. One clarifies detail, the other intensifies tone. Too much amygdala activity, and the scene becomes distorted, a story told in fear's exaggerations. Too little, and the memory fades, stripped of vitality. The harmony between them is delicate. It determines whether your past feels like instruction or imprisonment. When emotion overtakes reason, the amygdala floods the system with hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine. The world narrows. The hippocampus, trying to record, falters, details scatter. You remember moments as flashes, disjointed, sensory, overwhelming. The timeline collapses. This is the anatomy of trauma: memory without sequence, emotion without containment. But the same mechanism that creates fragmentation also allows repair. When you recall a painful moment within safety, through reflection, therapy, or deep conversation, the brain opens the old network again. The amygdala lights up, but now the body's signals of danger are quieter. The hippocampus, freed from panic, reorganizes the event. It rewrites the fear into knowledge, the helplessness into understanding. The past becomes livable again. This is why talking helps, why telling your story, especially the difficult ones, gradually takes away its sting. The words aren't magic. The repetition is. Every retelling weakens the original emotional charge, as the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex reframe what the amygdala once burned too brightly. It's as if you're lowering the emotional volume without erasing the song. But not all rewrites are gentle. Sometimes the amygdala clings too tightly. It can misinterpret present cues as echoes of old pain, a tone of voice, a smell, a word. In those moments, the brain replays the past as if it were happening again. The body tenses, the heart races, and you're momentarily trapped between now and then. This is not a failure of strength. It's a demonstration of how faithfully the brain protects you, even when it overreacts. The amygdala doesn't understand time. It only knows patterns, so it rings the same alarm whenever it detects resemblance, even when no threat remains. The hippocampus, wiser but slower, must remind it, this is different, that was before. Healing, at its core, is a conversation between these two, a dialogue of memory and mercy. Neuroimaging studies show this dynamic vividly. When people reframe painful memories with compassion, when they reinterpret rather than suppress, activity in the amygdala decreases while the prefrontal cortex strengthens its regulation. Emotion and cognition synchronize. The story changes. The wound remains visible, but it no longer bleeds. You can feel this shift in everyday life. The once painful song becomes bearable. A place once haunted by loss becomes a site of gratitude. Nothing external has changed. The neural duet has retuned itself. The amygdala still hums, but softly now, as part of a larger harmony. This capacity to transform pain into wisdom is uniquely human. Animals remember fear to avoid danger, but humans can reinterpret fear to find meaning. We don't just learn, we assign significance. The amygdala may start the story, but the cortex insists on a moral. It demands that even suffering serve a purpose. And perhaps that's why memory carries beauty alongside distortion. Each emotional mark is proof of having lived, of having cared enough for something to leave a trace. The amygdala's etchings are not scars of weakness, they are signatures of depth. Still, emotion's power can be intoxicating. It can make falsehood feel truer than fact, and nostalgia sweeter than reality. The brain, moved by feeling, sometimes confuses resonance with accuracy. You remember not how things were, but how they felt, and you trust that feeling as truth. That is the paradox of the emotional brain. Its distortions often make life bearable. The same chemistry that blurs details also gives color to existence. Without it, memory would be precise but meaningless, a gray archive of neutral data. With it, life glows, even if imperfectly. Yet beneath that glow lies another mystery. Emotion doesn't merely color individual memories, it shapes the story of self, the continuous thread that tells you who you've always been. But what happens when the story itself begins to shift, when identity becomes a moving landscape rather than a fixed point? That's where the next journey begins, in the fragile terrain between memory and identity, where the past doesn't just describe you, but defines what you think you are. You are the story your brain keeps telling to itself. Every second, fragments of memory flicker through neural circuits, stitching together a version of you coherent enough to stand in the mirror. But the truth is softer, more fluid. There is no fixed self behind those eyes, only continuity in motion. Your mind builds identity the same way it builds memory, through narrative. The hippocampus gathers experiences, the amygdala assigns emotional tone, and the prefrontal cortex weaves them into a plot that makes sense. I am this kind of person, the brain says, because to not know would be unbearable. It begins early. As children, before we can reason abstractly, we start forming autobiographical memories, tiny scenes that say, "This is me," falling off a bicycle, being comforted after a nightmare, feeling unseen in a room full of voices. Each becomes a neural thread, and the brain ties them into patterns of identity. These aren't just recollections, they're prototypes for future versions of yourself. But every time you remember one, you alter it, and in doing so, you alter who you are. The you of yesterday exists only in the folds of neural networks, reactivated and reinterpreted by the you of now. That's why, when you reflect on your childhood self, it feels like remembering someone you once loved, but no longer fully understand. You recognize the essence, not the details. From a neuroscientific lens, identity is not an object, it's an ongoing simulation. Your default mode network, the same system that activates during daydreams, self-reflection, and storytelling, runs continuous updates on who you think you are. It integrates feedback from emotion, memory, and imagination to ensure your inner narrative stays believable. It's like a screenwriter constantly revising a script to fit new plot twists without breaking character. Sometimes the updates are gentle. You remember an old embarrassment and feel compassion rather than shame. The script adjusts. Sometimes they're seismic, a heartbreak, an illness, a revelation that splits the story in two. In those moments, identity becomes unstable, and the storyteller must work quickly to restore coherence. You rewrite the plot. This is why that had to happen, not to deceive yourself, but to keep existing. The irony is that stability comes not from sameness, but from successful revision. The mind's resilience depends on its willingness to edit. A self that cannot rewrite its narrative becomes brittle, unable to absorb change. That's why clinging too tightly to an old identity, "I'm not the kind of person who fails," or "I've always been strong," can lead to suffering when reality shifts. The neural patterns that once protected you become cages. Memory reconsolidation plays a quiet role here too. Each time you recall a defining moment, an achievement, a betrayal, a promise, you open it to revision. The neural pattern softens. Your current self leaves new fingerprints on it. If you revisit it with gentleness, you may find forgiveness where there was blame, or pride where there was pain. That's how healing becomes not forgetting, but re-identifying. But this mechanism also explains why identity can fracture. When trauma overwhelms the system, the brain struggles to integrate the experience into the existing story. The event remains isolated, too intense, too foreign. The self avoids it, creating pockets of silence in memory. Over time, those unintegrated moments can form alternate narratives, disconnected from the main thread. The person functions, but the story has missing chapters. Still, even in fragmentation, the drive for coherence persists. Therapy, reflection, or creative expression often work by helping the brain rejoin those broken pieces, bringing the orphaned memories back into the main narrative. You reclaim not the past as it was, but as it can now be understood. Philosophically, this means identity is not a destination, but a dialogue. You are constantly negotiating between memory and meaning, between who you were and who you're becoming. Every choice, every reinterpretation, every act of remembering is a line added to your autobiography. Think of identity as a river rather than a sculpture. The shape looks constant from a distance, but up close it's always changing. New currents, new sediments, new reflections of sky. What endures is not the water itself, but the movement. The illusion of permanence is the continuity of flow. This fluidity is what makes growth possible. You can become someone gentler without erasing who you were. You can outgrow anger without pretending it never existed, because every former self still lives inside your neural architecture, faint but present, like fossils in a living reef. They don't vanish. They form the structure that supports new life. In this way, identity is both memory and aspiration, a synthesis of what has been and what might be. You remember yourself into existence each morning, and by night, the day's experiences have already begun reshaping who that yourself will be tomorrow. But what happens when the brain begins to confuse its creations, when the stories it tells about you start blending memory, imagination, and fantasy until truth itself becomes porous? That's where we turn next, to the mind's most paradoxical talent, its ability to fabricate memories so vivid they become part of who you are. The line between remembering and imagining, it turns out, is thinner than the space between two neurons firing in time. It begins innocently enough. You picture a moment you've told many times, a story that's become part of your identity, perhaps the night you stood up for yourself, or the day everything changed. You can see it vividly, the expressions, the air, the sequence of words. But one small problem lingers. You can't quite remember whether you remember it or just remember telling it. In that gap, something extraordinary happens. Your brain, unable to tolerate uncertainty, fills the space with imagination, so convincing it feels like fact. The storyteller and the witness merge, and a new memory is born, not false in feeling, but in origin. This is confabulation, the brain's unconscious art of fabrication. It doesn't happen because you intend to deceive, but because your mind cannot abide a hole in the story. It prefers invention over incompleteness. To the brain, coherence is truth enough. When you imagine an event, the same neural regions that light up during recall ignite: the hippocampus, visual cortex, amygdala, and prefrontal areas. Memory and imagination share the same circuitry. The difference lies not in where they occur, but in how long they persist. When an imagined scenario is revisited repeatedly, emotionally charged, or socially reinforced through storytelling, it can migrate from imagination to memory. Over time, it becomes neurologically indistinguishable from the real. You've seen this in your own life. Tell a story often enough, and your brain starts to believe the embellished details. Perhaps you've added a flourish here, a rearranged sequence there. You didn't mean to lie, you simply rehearsed the narrative until it felt natural. What began as expression became experience. This is how the past subtly evolves through retelling. Memory is not a museum, it's a theatre that restages its plays, nightly adjusting for audience and mood, and with every performance, the script drifts further from the premiere. There's both danger and beauty in this. The danger is obvious. False memories can reshape relationships, alter justice, fracture trust. The beauty is quieter. Through imagination, the brain repairs emotional continuity, creating closure where none existed. A memory softened by invention can heal the heart, even if it strays from fact. Consider how nostalgia works. When you recall simpler times, your brain often edits out discomfort and discord. It paints the past in warmer light, not because it forgot, but because it chose mercy over accuracy. It gives you a version of life you can hold without pain. The neurological mechanism behind this involves dopamine and serotonin, neurotransmitters that adjust the emotional weight of recollection. When the brain recalls something pleasant, dopamine subtly amplifies reward pathways, smoothing over jagged details. When it recalls something sad but meaningful, serotonin helps regulate the emotional tone, letting melancholy coexist with peace. The result is memory as art, not archive. This creative faculty is also what allows empathy. When you imagine someone else's experience vividly, you're borrowing your own memory machinery to simulate their reality. Your hippocampus and amygdala participate in their story as though it were yours. You construct possible memories of a life you haven't lived, and through that you understand. But the same power can mislead. In social situations, shared narratives often blur personal recall. A group reminisces about a trip or a night out. The details synchronize until everyone remembers a single hybrid version of events. The more often it's told, the more stable this collective fiction becomes. Memory becomes social truth, even if individual truth is lost. Philosophically, this raises an uncomfortable question. If memory is reconstructed, emotional and collaborative, does an objective past even exist within you? Or is the past simply the residue of what your present self finds meaningful enough to preserve? Perhaps reality for the mind is not about accuracy, but agreement. When enough parts of your brain and enough people around you consent to a version of events, it becomes real in the only way that matters, a shared understanding. Still, the process isn't flawless. When confabulation goes too far, as in certain neurological disorders like Korsakoff syndrome or dementia, the line between invention and history disappears entirely. The brain fabricates with confidence, protecting identity even as reality fractures. It's tragic, but also revealing. Even in illness, the mind's first loyalty is to coherence. For most of us, confabulation operates at a gentler scale. It's what lets you remember a sunset that never looked quite so golden, or a conversation that ended more gracefully than it did. It's the mind's way of transforming chaos into poetry. And perhaps that's not deception at all, but a deeper form of truth, emotional truth, the kind that preserves meaning even when detail falters. After all, your memories are not records of what happened, they're reflections of what mattered. Still, imagination's reach doesn't stop at the past. The same neural circuits that invent memories also project futures. Every plan, dream, or fear is a pre-memory waiting for life to confirm or disprove it. The brain rehearses potential realities long before they occur. So as we move forward, we step into the next paradox, the memory of the future, the mind's ability to imagine what hasn't yet happened using the very same machinery it uses to recall what has. And in that symmetry lies one of neuroscience's most poetic truths, that your imagination is not a tool for escaping reality, it's the mechanism by which you create it. Imagine this, you're walking through a quiet street, and suddenly you see a familiar building, one you've never consciously visited. A twinge of warmth, a spark of recognition passes through you. The scent of rain, the hue of the light, the texture of the bricks, everything feels remembered. You tell yourself it's déjà vu, but in truth, what you're feeling may be something even deeper. The echo of imagination mistaken for memory. The same system that lets you recall the past is the one that allows you to predict the future. This overlap is called prospection, the brain's remarkable ability to simulate events that haven't yet happened. It's your mind's quiet rehearsal room, the space where tomorrow takes its first breath. When you picture yourself walking into a meeting, holding a conversation, or standing on a distant shore, your hippocampus and prefrontal cortex activate together. These are the same regions that light up when you recall something real. The brain does not distinguish between remembering and imagining. It simply constructs experience. In both cases, it stitches together sensory fragments, emotional tones, and narrative coherence. This is the secret architecture of hope. Every time you anticipate something, you're building a memory in advance. You're creating an emotional template that will later influence how you actually experience that event. If you imagine success vividly, your brain lays down the same neural traces that real success would. If you dwell on fear, the same circuits rehearse failure. The mind prepares the body for the story it expects to live. Think of it as your brain's way of practicing survival and meaning. Your hippocampus replays old experiences, looking for patterns, while the prefrontal cortex projects those patterns into possible futures. Together, they build a bridge between what was and what could be. This bridge is what gives you the feeling of direction, the sense that your life is moving somewhere. Without this ability, time would collapse into a single point. You'd be trapped in the eternal present, unable to learn or plan. In fact, patients with hippocampal damage, those who cannot form new memories, also lose the ability to imagine coherent futures. When asked what they'll do tomorrow, they fall silent. Their minds can't reach forward because they can't reach backward. The past and future are two sides of the same map. But prospection isn't just prediction, it's storytelling in advance. The same creative bias that colors your memories colors your expectations. You don't just imagine the future, you edit it to fit your emotional needs. You make it more hopeful when you crave meaning, more tragic when you fear loss. And once that imagined future feels emotionally real, your brain begins to behave as if it's already true. This is why worry is exhausting. Each anxious thought is a rehearsal of catastrophe, complete with emotional realism. The amygdala doesn't know it's a simulation. It releases stress hormones as if the event were happening now. Similarly, optimism has real biological effects. Envisioning positive outcomes releases dopamine, motivating action and resilience. In both directions, your imagined future changes your present physiology. So your brain's constant what-ifs are not idle musings. They're neurological training sessions. The mind uses imagination to sculpt behavior before life demands it. It is practicing being you under countless hypothetical conditions, testing how your story might unfold. There's profound philosophy in this. The future you picture most vividly is the one your neurons begin preparing to inhabit. You are, in essence, remembering forward, but this gift has shadows. The same mechanism that grants hope also feeds despair. When the imagined future is painful, when loss or fear dominate, the body experiences a preview of suffering. Depression often thrives here. The inability to imagine a desirable tomorrow. The narrative machinery still runs, but it produces only bleak drafts. And yet, even in that darkness, the system remains open to revision. Just as you can reshape old memories through reconsolidation, you can reframe imagined futures through practice and compassion. Visualization, meditation, and reflection all work by gently rewriting the emotional script of what lies ahead. In doing so, they also alter how your brain recalls the past. It's a two-way current, memory influencing imagination, imagination rewriting memory. That circularity is what keeps identity alive. Each imagined future becomes a new point of reference for later recall, a memory waiting to be born. You are constantly becoming someone your mind has already begun to remember. Consider how you imagine an upcoming reunion with an old friend. Before it happens, you've already rehearsed the smiles, the words, the warmth of connection. When it finally occurs, your brain blends expectation with sensation, and afterward, your memory of the event is part lived, part imagined. Over time, they fuse completely. The boundary between anticipation and recollection disappears. It's beautiful, really, the way the mind folds time into itself. Every thought is both a glance backward and a gesture forward. Each moment of reflection plants the seed of another you. So the paradox stands: the mind's greatest tool for stability is its ability to imagine change. You survive by dreaming. But even as this creative cycle sustains you, it also exposes a deeper vulnerability. For if memory and imagination are mirrors facing each other, endlessly reflecting, how do you ever touch the real? To glimpse that tension between truth and the stories we invent, we must step beyond individual recollection and enter something larger, the collective memory, the shared rewriting that binds not just one mind, but many. Because memory doesn't end in your skull. It lives between us, passed from brain to brain, until it becomes the history of a people. Memory is not an isolated organ of the self. It's a social current, a river that flows through many minds at once. Every time you tell a story, you release part of your private past into the collective, where it mingles with the stories of others. Over time, those currents merge until the distinction between my memory and our memory becomes a blur. Think of a family gathering where everyone recalls the same childhood moment differently. At first, the contradictions are amusing. One sibling swears it was raining, another insists the sun was bright. But as laughter fills the room, the memories begin to converge. The group negotiates a shared version, one that feels truer than any individual's. That version becomes the story. Years later, everyone remembers it the same way, though none of them did at the start. This is collective memory, the brain's social extension of coherence. On a neural level, it's built from the same machinery that binds your personal memories together. When people share stories, their brains synchronize. Studies using fMRI show that listeners' brainwaves begin to mirror those of the storyteller, especially in regions related to understanding and emotion. The hippocampus of one mind activates in tandem with another, as if two brains were temporarily co-writing the same experience. It's a biological form of empathy. Through narrative, your brain invites others into its reconstruction of the past, and their brains respond by simulating it. The result is an invisible web of shared recollections, a collective autobiography continually edited through conversation, culture, and repetition. Cultures use this same mechanism to create identity. Myths, rituals, and national histories function as large-scale reconsolidations. Every retelling strengthens the neural patterns that define belonging. When a community remembers together through ceremony, education, or storytelling, individual brains align around a common emotional tone. It's not just tradition, it's neurological synchronization. But shared memory can heal or harm. When it's shaped by empathy, it creates unity, a sense that our experiences, though unique, resonate with one another. When it's shaped by fear, it becomes ideology, the selective remembering and forgetting that hardens division. Nations, like individuals, edit their histories to preserve coherence. They amplify victories, soften wrongs, and erase contradictions. The mechanism is the same as in the single brain, a preference for meaning over accuracy. Yet within this bias lies a subtle grace. Shared stories are how humanity survives complexity. No single person can grasp the whole truth, but together, through overlapping recollections, we approximate it. Like neurons in a vast cultural brain, our individual truths form a larger intelligence, flawed, emotional, and astonishingly adaptive. You can feel this process in microcosm. Every time you reminisce with someone you love, you trade details, adjust timelines, correct each other. The point isn't accuracy, it's connection. Each correction is an act of intimacy, a signal that says, I remember too, and I want our stories to fit. The shared memory becomes a living thread between you, stretching through time. Even silence participates in this exchange. When two people have lived something unspoken, grief, awe, love, their nervous systems remember together. The brain stores not only words, but shared glances, synchronized breaths, and mirrored postures. These embodied memories form what scientists call interpersonal neural synchrony, a physiological harmony that binds people through the rhythms of their bodies. Philosophically, collective memory reveals an even deeper paradox. If memories are constantly co-authored, then identity is never entirely private. Who you are depends not only on what you recall, but on how others remember you. Their words, their interpretations, their presence in your story become part of your neural fabric. That's why a compliment can linger for years, or a careless remark can echo painfully long after it's said. Your brain incorporates these interactions as living edits to your autobiography. Memory is porous, we write each other. But collective memory also grants redemption. When your version of a painful story is witnessed and reframed by another, when someone helps you see yourself with compassion, their empathy becomes a neural event in you. The hippocampus records their understanding alongside your own. The story changes shape. Healing, in this sense, is not solitude but communion. This is the spiritual side of neuroscience. The recognition that consciousness, though individually housed, is socially sustained. Each brain is a solitary island connected by invisible bridges of shared recollection. Through those bridges, we lend each other continuity. And yet, there's a cost to sharing memory. Every exchange leaves fingerprints. Tell a story often enough, and you may lose track of where your version ends and another's begins. The memory becomes public property, its edges worn smooth by repetition. That's the quiet tragedy of fame, of collective trauma, of history itself. When memory passes through too many hands, it stops belonging to anyone, yet refuses to fade. Still, even in distortion, there's beauty. The collective mind is humanity's way of staying alive through time, a chorus that remembers so no single voice must carry the weight alone. But beyond this shared remembering lies another, stranger theatre, the mind's nightly workshop, where memories are dismantled, remixed and reborn while you sleep. Dreams, as we'll soon see, are the brain's most creative form of editing, a rehearsal not of what was, but of what could be. Because when the conscious mind rests, the story doesn't stop, it just begins to dream itself anew. At night, when the world falls silent and consciousness loosens its grip, your brain begins its most creative work. Beneath the quiet of sleep, billions of neurons ignite in patterns of rehearsal, as if the mind were editing a film behind closed eyelids. Scenes replay, emotions shift, fragments blend. You are no longer the author of the story, you're the stage on which it unfolds. Dreams are not random, though they may seem that way. They are the brain's language of integration, the way memory, emotion, and imagination negotiate peace after the chaos of the day. During sleep, the hippocampus, amygdala, and neocortex enter a slow conversation. Experiences from waking life are replayed, re-evaluated, and woven into existing networks. The day's sensations dissolve into symbol, its meanings are redistributed through metaphor. It begins with slow-wave sleep, when your hippocampus replays the events of the day like a soft echo, sending their patterns to the cortex for long-term storage. This is memory consolidation, the process of transforming fleeting experience into lasting knowledge. But as night deepens and you enter REM sleep, something more fluid happens. The gates between emotion and reason open wide. The amygdala fires with intensity. The prefrontal cortex relaxes its grip, and imagination floods the neural stage. The result is dreaming, the brain's unguarded poetry. In this space, boundaries blur. The mind stitches unrelated memories together, creating impossible juxtapositions, faces where they shouldn't be, landscapes that fold into one another, fears and desires entangled. These aren't errors, they're experiments. Dreams test emotional hypotheses, combining fragments to see how they fit. The brain is learning through metaphor. Think of it like this. Every night your neural archive becomes a painter's studio. The hippocampus lays out the day's sketches, the amygdala adds color from the palette of feeling, and the cortex brushes in context and story. When the painting is done, you awaken to a slightly revised mind. You don't remember all the strokes, but you live by them. That's why after certain dreams you wake lighter. The emotional charge has shifted, the memory feels processed. In scientific terms, REM sleep allows for emotional homeostasis. The amygdala's high activity during dreams helps the brain re-experience intense feelings in a safe environment, while the absence of stress hormones like norepinephrine ensures those emotions don't re-traumatize you. It's as if your brain is gently re-exposing itself to its own pain, but with anesthesia. Dreams, then, are therapy without words. They let you rehearse survival and transformation without consequence. In them, you can lose, grieve, love, or fail, and still wake whole. But dreams also serve the imagination of the future. The same neural circuits that replay the past during sleep are the ones that simulate the future during wakefulness. By recombining old fragments into new patterns, the dreaming brain creates templates of possibility. It's testing out futures you haven't lived yet, running emotional simulations to prepare you for what may come. Artists, scientists, and thinkers throughout history have drawn from this nocturnal theatre. Kekule's vision of the benzene ring, Paul McCartney's melody for Yesterday, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, all were gifts from dreams. In each case, the brain used its night hours to solve problems the waking mind couldn't. It found meaning through rearrangement. From a philosophical view, dreaming shows how memory is not about the past, but about continuity. The brain's goal is not to preserve life as it was, but to integrate it into what it's becoming. Dreaming is that integration in motion, a nightly rehearsal for identity. Even nightmares have purpose. When you wake with your heart racing, drenched in fear, it's easy to think something went wrong. But nightmares are the psyche's way of testing its alarms, exposing you to fear in simulation so you can better handle it in reality. Your brain is not torturing you, it's training you. It's saying, this is how fear feels. Let's practice surviving it here, where nothing can touch you. The poetic irony is that the same chemistry that produces nightmares also fuels creativity. High amygdala activity, reduced logical control, and vivid sensory imagination. Together they form the perfect storm for invention. Your dreams are emotional improvisations on the theme of your life. And when morning comes, even if you forget their details, the edits remain. The hippocampus resaves the memories it replayed, altered subtly by emotional resolution. The prefrontal cortex reorganizes priorities. What once felt chaotic now feels clearer, though you may not know why. Dreaming proves that the brain is never at rest. While you lie still, it rewrites the script of who you are, compressing thousands of fragments into coherence, shaping tomorrow's reactions through tonight's metaphors. It's an unseen collaboration between biology and meaning, neuron and narrative. But there's a deeper wonder here. This constant recombination of experience doesn't just reshape your past or your identity, it allows you to imagine the future self who will one day look back at this very moment. That ability to anticipate who you'll become reveals the brain's most mysterious talent, remembering forward, inventing memory before it exists. And so, as the mind drifts from dream to waking, it carries with it the faint echo of futures not yet lived, waiting to be remembered. You awaken from a dream, and for a brief moment, you're both the dreamer and the dreamed, the one who lived it and the one who remembers it. That duality never really fades. It is the quiet pattern of consciousness itself, the self observing the self, each remembering the other into existence. Every act of waking is an act of reinvention. You open your eyes, and your brain rushes to rebuild you, piecing together who you were before sleep erased the edges. Your name, your relationships, your unfinished worries, your quiet hopes, all return, reconstructed from memory. The continuity feels seamless, but beneath it lies a miracle of neurological coordination. In seconds, countless neural networks synchronize, drawing your identity back from scattered storage like fragments of a hologram. And yet you are not the same person who fell asleep. During the night, your dreams rewired emotional connections, strengthened some memories, pruned others. Your brain literally changed while you rested. The you that wakes carries traces of someone who no longer exists, an earlier draft replaced by this morning's revision. Identity, then, is not an anchor. It's a current. It flows through time, reshaping itself with each thought, each memory, each reflection. Neuroscientists describe this as the continuity of self-processing, the brain's ongoing effort to integrate past, present, and imagined futures into a single narrative. Philosophers call it becoming. Both are correct. Think of your selfhood as a constellation. The stars are your memories, stable enough to recognize, yet shifting imperceptibly as your inner sky rotates. You navigate by familiar patterns, even though their exact positions change each night. The shape endures because you keep tracing it. Inside the brain, this tracing happens through the interplay of memory networks and the default mode network, the circuit that activates when your mind turns inward. It's the same system that lights up during reflection, storytelling, and imagination. Its rhythm is recursive. You think about yourself thinking, remember yourself remembering. Each loop refines your sense of I. But this recursion has limits. Too much attachment to an old self, and the loop becomes rigid. The brain resists new information. Too much change, and the thread of continuity frays. Life feels disjointed. Healthy identity depends on oscillation, the dance between constancy and transformation. Emotion, again, is the metronome of this dance. Joy, grief, pride, regret, they signal which versions of yourself deserve preservation and which are ready to evolve. You hold on to the selves that once protected or defined you until it's safe to release them. Memory is the ritual of that release. Each recollection is a quiet farewell to who you were when it happened. You might notice this when revisiting an old diary or photo. The words or faces seem familiar but distant, as if belonging to someone you once inhabited. You can empathize with that version of you, but you no longer are them. What you feel is affection, the emotional residue of self-recognition across time. That gentle distance is evolution made visible. The brain has preserved the emotional truth while softening the immediacy. The event remains, but the I who lived it has retired. In their place stands a narrator, you now, telling the story with new understanding. This process is not linear. The self loops backward constantly, revising old scenes in light of new experiences. Each realization you have today rewrites the emotional tone of yesterday. When you find forgiveness for someone, your brain edits the past argument. When you understand your parents differently, your childhood memories transform in hue. You think you're gaining wisdom, but you're also gaining authorship over your own timeline. It's astonishingly physical. Each time you reinterpret your story, neurons in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex rewire. Synaptic connections that once encoded pain are now paired with insight. The old neural paths are not erased, but rerouted. They carry new meaning through familiar terrain. This flexibility has profound implications. It means you are not trapped by history. You are its editor. The same brain that once encoded fear can later encode compassion. The same memory that once limited you can become the foundation of empathy. Philosophically, this makes identity an act of imagination. You are constantly projecting versions of yourself forward, testing possible futures, and then remembering them backward as though they were inevitable. It's the reason hindsight feels so natural. The brain folds the future it imagined into the past it recalls, creating the illusion of destiny. But the paradox is that destiny, like memory, is self-made. You are not who you were yesterday, yet you carry yesterday's resonance. You are not who you will be tomorrow, yet you are already rehearsing their emotions. Identity is continuity through change, a story constantly rewriting itself without losing its voice. And in that continuity lies tenderness, because to realize how fluid you are is to forgive yourself for not being consistent. The mind was never built for constancy, it was built for coherence. Coherence means you can change and still belong to yourself. Somewhere within this truth, you might feel a quiet gratitude. Every cell, every memory, every feeling, all have collaborated to keep you recognizable to yourself. That's the mind's quiet gift, to change everything without letting you disappear. But what happens when the tools of memory fail, when the hippocampus falters, when the storyteller forgets its own language? What happens when the self begins to dissolve before the memories do? To face that question, we must step into the fragile frontier of loss, where forgetting reveals what memory truly means. There comes a moment in every life when memory begins to slip, not dramatically at first, but like the tide quietly pulling from the shore. You forget why you walked into a room, misplace a thought mid-sentence, or lose the thread of a story you've told countless times. It's easy to dismiss these lapses as trivial, yet beneath them lies something profound. The reminder that the self we depend on, the storyteller, the archivist, the inner witness, is built on fragile biology. Inside your hippocampus and cortical networks, the neurons that once fired together to form memories gradually lose their synchrony. The connections weaken, the orchestra falters, but this fading isn't only about decay, it's about reallocation. The brain, even in aging, is still trying to adapt, pruning redundant paths, focusing on meaning rather than minutiae. You remember less perhaps, but you feel more. To understand what happens when memory unravels, imagine two selves: the remembering self, who collects details, arranges sequences, maintains narrative, and the experiencing self, who feels life moment by moment without the burden of recall. As the remembering self softens with age or illness, the experiencing self becomes more prominent. You live increasingly in the immediacy of sensation, the warmth of light, the sound of a voice, the rhythm of your own breath. The present expands as the past contracts. From a neuroscientific view, this transition mirrors the shifting balance between hippocampal and sensory cortical networks. When memory circuits weaken, sensory and emotional pathways take precedence. It's as though the brain, sensing its own impermanence, turns toward direct experience, a final act of mindfulness written into its structure. But sometimes the unraveling goes further. In conditions like Alzheimer's or dementia, the hippocampus begins to atrophy, its cells dying faster than they can repair. The timeline fractures. Memories no longer link coherently. Events float free, disconnected from sequence. Loved ones' faces remain familiar, but unanchored. You know them, yet not where they belong in your story. The continuity of self flickers like an old film, losing frames. And yet, something luminous remains. Even when language fades, music can still stir emotion. Even when names are lost, touch can awaken recognition. The amygdala, but keeper of emotional tone, endures long after declarative memory dissolves. It remembers the feeling of love, even when the reason for it has vanished. A person may forget who you are, but still smile when they see you, because the emotional imprint of safety and affection persists. That is the quiet mercy of the brain. When facts falter, feelings remain. Emotion is the final language of memory. To witness someone losing their memories is to confront the mystery of identity stripped of story. You see how much of selfhood depends on recall, and yet, paradoxically, how much still exists without it. The laughter, the gestures, the small acts of kindness, they outlive narrative. The self is reduced not to nothing, but to essence. Philosophers have long wondered whether memory is the soul's anchor. Neuroscience, observing the slow erasure of recollection, offers a gentler view. Perhaps memory isn't the soul, but its instrument. When the instrument fails, the melody doesn't vanish. It lingers faintly in resonance. The body remembers in ways the mind no longer can. In that sense, forgetting is not the opposite of remembering, it's its completion. Every memory, to fulfill its purpose, must eventually dissolve back into presence. The brain writes, stores, retrieves, and then gracefully, inevitably, releases. It's the cycle that keeps consciousness light enough to move forward. Think of how, even in healthy minds, forgetting serves renewal. You can't carry every moment. The weight would crush you. Forgetting allows emotion to fade into wisdom, experience into intuition. It makes space for the new. It's the brain's way of pruning the garden so fresh growth can occur. There's a quiet beauty in that. The moments you've lost haven't vanished. They've been absorbed into the texture of who you've become. You don't recall every conversation that shaped your kindness, or every failure that forged your strength. But they're there, transformed from memory into character. In this light, forgetting becomes an act of trust. Trust that what truly matters will remain, even without conscious recall. The essence of your story, distilled by time, persists not in details, but in tone, rhythm, and presence. The self that emerges from forgetting is not diminished, it's refined, but there is still a shadow.
Aye.
The loss of memory challenges our deepest understanding of love and continuity. When someone you cherish forgets you, you feel erased. Yet love, like memory, is not one-directional. The recognition you lose in their eyes still lives in your own. You remember for both. You carry their story when they can no longer carry yours. In that exchange, memory becomes communal again, consciousness shared across two minds. Perhaps that's how we transcend forgetting through others. Our memories survive not only in neurons, but in the people who have known us, in their laughter, their language, their remembrance. The brain may falter, but the echo travels outward. And so the fading of memory is not an ending, but a return, a surrender of the individual story back into the collective one. The self that was once sharply outlined becomes softer, more universal, merging into the shared continuity of human remembrance. In that dissolution, something sacred appears, the realization that even as we forget, we remain remembered by others, by the world, by the gentle persistence of feeling itself. But before memory fully dissolves, before we surrender to that vast forgetting, there's one last transformation the mind performs, a final grace, the art of forgiveness, where the past loses its sting and becomes at last a story you can rest within. Forgiveness is one of the brain's most mysterious feats, not because it erases pain, but because it rewrites its emotional signature. You remember the hurt, the betrayal, the moment your world contracted into silence, and yet, somehow, it no longer burns. The facts remain, but their weight is gone. Something inside you has changed the chemistry of the past. At its core, forgiveness is a neurological act of editing. When you recall a painful memory, your brain reactivates the same network of neurons that encoded the event. The hippocampus retrieves the sequence. The amygdala rekindles the emotion. But if, in that moment of recall, your prefrontal cortex introduces compassion for yourself or for the one who hurt you, the emotional tone begins to shift. The amygdala's alarm quiets. The cortisol levels fall. Dopamine and oxytocin, the neurochemicals of safety and connection, begin to rise. And when the memory reconsolidates, it carries those new emotional notes with it. You have not forgotten, you have redefined. This is why forgiveness often feels less like a choice and more like a physiological release, a softening of the muscles, a sigh that starts deep in the body. It is the nervous system realizing that the threat is no longer present. What once triggered defense now invites reflection. The memory stops shouting, it begins to whisper. Science sees this in scans. When people recall painful experiences after forgiveness therapy, their limbic activation decreases, while the prefrontal regions, those associated with empathy, perspective, and self-awareness, strengthen their connections. It's as if the storyteller of the brain takes the pen back from the wounded child and writes the scene again, not to erase it, but to understand it. This is the biology of transcendence, the mind freeing itself through meaning. Forgiveness doesn't excuse the act. It transforms its architecture inside you. The neural pattern once bound to fear and anger now coexists with insight. The event that once defined your suffering becomes a chapter in your evolution. And as this reframing repeats, through conversation, reflection, or simple quiet acceptance, the new emotional map stabilizes. The past no longer dictates the present. In spiritual traditions, this process is called grace. In neuroscience, it's called emotional reattribution. Both describe the same phenomenon, the rewriting of memory through understanding. There's a metaphor hidden in this process, one your body already knows. When you cut your skin, the wound doesn't restore the original tissue. It grows scar tissue, stronger and less sensitive. The body doesn't forget the injury, it remembers it differently. The scar says, I was broken here and I healed. Forgiveness is the scar of the mind. But there's another layer. Forgiveness changes not only the memory of others, but the memory of self. The hardest person to forgive is often the one inside you, the version that made the wrong choice, the one who failed to speak, the one who caused pain. To forgive yourself is to allow the mind's editing process to extend inward, to apply compassion to your own neural record. It's giving permission to reframe shame as growth. The brain resists this at first. Shame and guilt are ancient motivators, coded to enforce social survival, but held too long, they poison memory, turning recollection into a loop of self-condemnation. When you finally decide to forgive yourself, you interrupt that loop. You introduce novelty into an old pattern, and the hippocampus, ever sensitive to change, updates the emotional file. In that way, forgiveness is not an ending, but a biological renewal. It allows the past to be remembered without being relived. You might still recall the face, the words, the consequences, but the emotional charge has been metabolized. What remains is information, not injury. And the benefits ripple outward. Studies show that those who practice forgiveness experience reduced blood pressure, improved immune function, and greater emotional resilience. Their brains exhibit lower baseline stress responses. Forgiveness, it seems, is not just a moral virtue, it's an evolved strategy for survival. Yet the process can't be forced. Forgiveness arrives when the brain is ready, when it has gathered enough safety to rewrite the memory without fear of collapse. Sometimes that takes years. Sometimes it happens in an instant, triggered by a single empathetic thought. They too were afraid. That's the amygdala quieting, the prefrontal cortex whispering, we can stop running now. Philosophically, forgiveness reveals a deeper truth about memory. That meaning always wins over detail. The event fades, but its lesson endures. Forgiveness ensures that what remains is not bitterness, but wisdom. The scar becomes a line of poetry carved into the architecture of self, an inscription that says, you have lived, you have learned, and you are free. But there is one more transformation the mind must perform before the story can rest. An act not of editing, but of letting go altogether. Because even forgiveness, as gentle as it is, still engages memory. True peace arrives when the brain learns the beauty of erasure, when forgetting becomes not a failure, but a final mercy. That is where we turn next, into the tender art of forgetting, the quiet dissolution through which the brain protects its balance and the self becomes light enough to move forward. Forgetting has always been misunderstood, treated as an enemy of intellect, a thief of experience, but in truth, it is one of the brain's greatest acts of mercy. Without forgetting, the mind would drown in detail, suffocated by every unfiltered moment it ever absorbed. Forgetting is not the loss of wisdom, it's the refinement of it. It's how your brain decides what deserves to live within you. Deep in your synapses, forgetting is an active process, not neglect but pruning. The brain literally dismantles connections between neurons that no longer serve a purpose, trimming its vast network like a gardener tending to overgrowth. This process, known as synaptic downscaling, happens mostly during sleep. As you rest, the brain reviews the day's experiences, strengthening useful patterns and dismantling those that clutter the narrative. It is choosing coherence over chaos. The hippocampus and neocortex participate in this nightly negotiation. The hippocampus holds recent memories like wet clay, malleable and transient. The cortex, older and wiser, decides which impressions to keep. What doesn't integrate into meaning is allowed to dissolve. It's not erased so much as it's returned to the reservoir of possibility, fragments that might someday resurface as intuition or déjà vu. You can feel this in subtle ways. Think of a song you once played endlessly but can no longer recall in full. Only its emotional residue remains, a faint pulse of mood without melody. The brain has kept the essence but spared you the repetition. Forgetting in this way is an act of compassion. It keeps experience digestible. Scientifically, this process is guided by microglial cells, the brain's quiet custodians. They wander through neural tissue, pruning weak synapses, clearing molecular debris. These microscopic gardeners decide which memories remain accessible and which fade into the hum of background noise. Without them, the mind would become an overgrown forest, rich but impenetrable. Philosophically, forgetting grants space for renewal. If memory is the architecture of identity, forgetting is the open window that lets in air. It allows you to reinterpret, to forgive, to begin again. To forget is not to betray your past, but to set it free from stagnation. Consider how the mind instinctively forgets pain once healing begins. You remember the injury, but not the sharpness of it. The body's memory transforms sensation into story. The same happens emotionally. The anguish that once consumed you softens into something bearable, even meaningful. The neural circuits that encoded suffering are still there, but their intensity has dimmed. The forgetting is partial, enough to honor the past without reliving it. And yet, forgetting is not always benign. When it comes unbidden through trauma, illness, or time, it can feel like betrayal. To forget a name, a voice, a detail of someone you loved can feel like losing them twice. You search the corridors of your mind, knowing the memory exists somewhere, unreachable but alive. This ache, too, is biological. The brain prioritizes emotional relevance. When grief no longer threatens survival, it quietly relocates the memory to deeper storage, where access is rare but not impossible. Still, there's a tenderness in this design. The mind protects you from carrying more than you can hold. Even loss, in time, is softened by the mercy of fading. What was once unbearable becomes merely poignant. Forgetting ensures that love outlasts pain. In a deeper sense, forgetting is the natural companion of time. As your neurons age, proteins degrade, and synaptic efficiency wanes. It might seem tragic, but there's a poetry to it. The self becomes lighter, less burdened by detail, more devoted to essence. You start remembering what matters instead of what happened. The narrative becomes less about precision and more about truth. When you look back across decades, what remains isn't the chronology of events, but the emotional through line, the feeling of being alive, of having loved, struggled, wondered. Your memories compress into meaning, the way sunlight compresses into gold. Forgetting is how the brain distills time into understanding. There is even evidence that forgetting aids creativity. When the brain releases rigid associations, it gains freedom to recombine ideas in new ways. Forgetting the path allows discovery of a different one. The absence of old connections makes room for imagination to wander. So perhaps forgetting is not a failure, but the mind's gesture toward transcendence, its way of preparing for the unknown. Every unremembered moment becomes the soil from which future insight will grow. And one day, when memory itself begins to thin and the details of your story fade into mist, what will remain will not be the sequence, but the soul of the story, the emotional signature of your existence. The kindness you gave, the wonder you felt, the forgiveness you offered. In that final clarity, forgetting will no longer be something done to you, but something done for you, the brain's last act of grace, releasing you from the weight of remembering everything. But before that surrender arrives, there is still one final frontier the mind must cross, the threshold between memory and meaning, where the past dissolves not into absence but into wisdom. Because in the end, the purpose of remembering was never to preserve life exactly as it was, but to learn how to let it go beautifully. At some point, the question shifts from what do I remember to what remains after memory. When the facts grow faint, what endures is not sequence but significance. Beneath all the neural fireworks and chemical whispers, the brain's deepest purpose has never been to store the past. It has been to extract meaning from it. Meaning is the afterlife of memory. It's what survives the pruning, the rewriting, the fading. When neurons forget the details, the emotional pattern persists, refined and condensed. It's the reason you can no longer recall every word of a conversation, but still carry the wisdom it gave you. It's the reason an old heartbreak can become gratitude decades later. The content dissolves, the lesson remains. In the language of neuroscience, meaning is the synthesis of integration, the collaboration of the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and limbic system working to summarize vast experience into usable truth. When they align, the brain achieves coherence, a sense that your story, however fragmented, makes sense. This coherence is what allows peace. The philosopher in you already knows this. You feel it in the still moments. That quiet recognition that all you've been through wasn't random, that every memory, pleasant or painful, was an ingredient in something whole. That feeling is not imagination. It's neurochemical harmony. It's your brain achieving balance between chaos and clarity. This process is ongoing. Even now, as you reflect, your prefrontal cortex is reorganizing connections, linking old memories to new insights. You're not simply recalling, you're evolving. Each realization you have sends a pulse backward through time, subtly rewriting the story that led here. The meaning you make in this instant travels retroactively, softening what came before. It's astonishing, the way consciousness can move both directions across its own timeline. You heal the past by understanding the present. You prepare the future by reinterpreting what has already happened. In that flow, memory becomes a living organism, self-correcting, self-transcending. You might think of meaning as memory's final metamorphosis. Just as a caterpillar sheds the form that carried it, your experiences eventually shed their literalness. They become abstract, symbolic, almost archetypal. A childhood fear becomes courage. A loss becomes love, remembered in absence. A mistake becomes humility. The personal becomes universal. From a biological perspective, this transition is marked by a shift from episodic to semantic memory. The hippocampus, which once held events as stories, gradually hands them off to the neocortex, where they are distilled into general knowledge and timeless principles. It's how the brain conserves energy and preserves wisdom by transforming event into essence. This is why the oldest memories often come back as feelings rather than facts. The neural scaffolding of the story has faded, but the emotional core, stored in deep limbic structures, remains. When you say, "I can't explain it, but I know it in my bones," that's literal. Your nervous system remembers even when your narrative mind cannot. And in that quiet shift, something beautiful occurs. The self begins to loosen. The boundaries between me and my memories start to blur. You realize that the story you've been telling isn't fixed. It's a constellation of meanings that keep rearranging themselves into new patterns. The self becomes less a noun and more a verb, not who you are, but what you are becoming. Meaning-making, then, is not just mental, it's existential. It's how the brain translates biology into purpose. You might even say that meaning is the mind's response to mortality, the refusal to let experience vanish untransformed. Every reflection, every insight, every act of understanding is the nervous system whispering, "Let nothing be wasted." From this perspective, memory loss itself, that final erosion of detail, is not the enemy of meaning, but its proof. The brain lets go of the surface so it can keep what truly matters. Even if you lose the narrative thread, its moral remains imprinted in your emotions, your choices, your character. Meaning is what allows continuity without memory. It's why you can forget the story, but still feel wiser, why you can't recall the exact words of love, but still live by their warmth. It's the residue of understanding, the part of you that doesn't need remembering, because it has already become you. In a sense, meaning is memory's final gift before it dissolves. It tells you, you've learnt enough to move on. It's the neural equivalent of acceptance, the release that comes when the brain recognizes that it has fulfilled its task of translating life into wisdom. And from that point, the mind begins to slow its endless revision, preparing not to remember or imagine, but to simply be. Because once meaning has been harvested, the story no longer needs to be told. It can finally be lived in silence. But there's one last movement in this long symphony, one that lies beyond remembering, beyond meaning. It is the surrender of the storyteller itself, the quiet state where awareness remains, but the need for story fades. The brain, at peace with its own impermanence, rests in pure presence. That is the final paradox of memory. You spend a lifetime building a self from recollection, only to find freedom in letting it all go. There comes a silence after meaning, a pause where the mind, having sifted through decades of experience, grows still, not empty, not absent, but deeply quiet. It's the silence of completion, the feeling that nothing more needs to be understood, because everything has already been woven together. In this silence, memory ceases to be narrative. It becomes atmosphere, a presence without shape. You no longer recall moments one by one. You sense them as a unified tone, a subtle hum beneath your awareness. The past, once fragmented and restless, has folded into coherence. You can feel it in your body, the way a deep exhale softens the chest, that knowing without words. Neuroscientists describe this state as default mode quieting, when the networks responsible for self-reference and inner monologue grow less active. It often occurs during meditation or contemplative reflection. The prefrontal cortex, which usually narrates experience, releases its grip. The brain stops rehearsing identity and instead allows pure perception. Awareness remains, but the storyteller steps aside. This is not loss, it's liberation. The mind no longer needs to define itself through the past. The hippocampus rests, the amygdala quiets, the circuits of memory and imagination intertwine in stillness. What remains is presence, consciousness unburdened by continuity. You may have felt glimpses of this in your life, standing before a vast landscape, watching rain dissolve into earth, holding someone's hand without needing to speak. In those moments, memory dissolves into immediacy. The brain, freed from its endless task of remembering, finally experiences life unfiltered. From a biological standpoint, such states are the brain's way of restoring equilibrium. They allow networks to synchronize, repair, and integrate. From a philosophical standpoint, they are something holier, the mind returning to its original rhythm, the rhythm before story, before separation. It's as if the brain, after years of constructing reality, finally realizes it is reality. The observer and the observed merge. The self, which once appeared as the sum of all memories, becomes the space in which memories appear. You realize that consciousness itself is the constant, the quiet witness that has watched every version of you come and go. And in that realization, fear begins to fade. You no longer cling to your memories for proof of existence. You don't need to preserve them, because you feel what they were always trying to tell you, that you have been here, that you are. The brain, once driven to record and analyze, now learns the grace of simplicity. The prefrontal cortex, so eager to plan and categorize, surrenders to the slow waves of the present. It becomes less a command center and more an instrument tuned to the rhythm of being. The nervous system hums at a lower frequency, coherence spreading like quiet light through the body. This physiological calm has a spiritual resonance. The same parasympathetic pathways that slow the heart and deepen the breath also quiet the mind. Biology and transcendence meet in the same pulse. The body becomes a temple for stillness. In this state, memory doesn't vanish, it transforms. It becomes intuition, compassion, presence. You no longer recall wisdom, you embody it. You don't remember love, you are it. The self stops reaching backward or forward and begins to radiate outward. Awareness becomes its own memory, timeless, continuous, complete. Perhaps this is what the mystics meant by awakening, not the gaining of knowledge, but the exhaustion of the need to know. When the brain's storytelling finally rests, what remains is consciousness itself, vast, unburdened, luminous. And even if thoughts return, even if memories flicker back to life, they are now lighter, gentler, understood as echoes rather than anchors. You see them drift by, each one a fragment of the grand narrative your mind once built. You smile at them, grateful but not bound. It's tempting to call this peace, but even that word feels too loud. It's more like the space between breaths, quiet, effortless, infinite. And in that space, the paradox of memory resolves itself. You realize that remembering and forgetting were never opposites, they were partners dancing you toward this stillness. Every recollection, every loss, every rewrite was leading here to the awareness that needs no story to exist. When you reach this silence, there is nothing left to explain. Only presence remains, spacious, tender, whole. The brain rests. The story ends. You, the remembering mind, have become the memory of the universe remembering itself.